Okay. I want to move on to two more topics today that I want to cover, and that is this whole notion that you'll see in the Gadamer article on hermeneutics and interpretation, and why that's so relevant to what we're going to be doing here. And then the question of violence as a religious duty, or the question of militant violence in the name of religion. And what are the interpretations of that, and where does it come from, and what are the responses to it? So, as far as this word hermeneutics really disturbs everybody every year. It's Hermeneutics, and basically it just simply means the science of interpretation. And even that is, it's not easy to describe what this is. It has a history of the ways of interpreting sacred text. This came out of biblical studies. It came out of looking at the way we interpret these traditions and trying to make sense of how we interpret. But over a period of a couple of hundred years, it evolved into a very interesting notion of of interpreting the world as a whole, of seeing our basic way of looking at the world as one of interpretation. This is very much a phenomenon of modern thinking since the Enlightenment, and of responding to the Enlightenment, but the Enlightenment also responding to earlier forms of science, is that we're constantly asking, the basic question, what's out there? How do you determine what's out there? What's real? It's a basic question of philosophy. I think, therefore I am, begins with the assumption I can only assume I know what I think, and therefore I am, the Cartesian statement. Basically, as time has gone on the one hand, Western thinking was moving more towards hard science as a way of seeing the world and a deeper way of looking at that hard science. And on the other hand, recognizing that there are limitations to our perception, that things are not clearly what meets the eye. So the modern question versus the postmodern question. A lot of postmodern analysis, and even Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which you may be studying in other courses, is really an admission that what looks like science and looks hard and out there and clearly out there has a lot to do with what's inside of me. So that part of the difficulty or the problem of going from a sun-centered universe or a human-centered universe to another interpretation of the universe is the fact that all this evidence was adding up that there was something wrong with the Ptolemaic universe. And yet scientists for hundreds and hundreds of years resisted that. And the church certainly saw it as a direct threat to theology. So between the two of them, between religious authority and between the tendency of our own brains to resist new paradigms, what looked like science turned out not to be science. And ever since then, and as we've moved towards a scientific revolution, we realize there isn't just one scientific revolution, there are revolutions all the time. And there are ways of framing things and looking at things that are not clearly objective or non-objective. There are approximations trying to understand what's out there, but it also seems to have a lot to do with what's inside of us. Now, in a certain way, hermeneutics, or the science of interpretation, has moved in the same direction, especially through somebody by the name of Hans Gadamer, Gadamer. And Mary Stenger's article is largely based on Hans Gadamer's work. He died just a few years ago at the age of 102 in Heidelberg, and German philosopher his whole life. And he specialized in evolving this approach to hermeneutics or interpretation in a very specific direction that was rooted in some of his teachers, and particularly Martin Heidegger. Now, he had adversaries, and I'll explain to you why in a moment. He had some adversaries in German thinking, and I'll explain why. Basically, some of the categories of this hermeneutic thinking are that there's no such thing as me seeing this work of art. And the study, the philosophy of art has a lot to do with the way he thinks. Is that there's no such thing as me looking at this piece of art without me bringing to it some foreknowledge or prior understanding of what this art would be. Even if it's just that I know that it's going to be paint on canvas. If I don't understand paint on canvas becoming a work of art, I don't understand this Picasso. The more I have foreknowledge of where Picasso came from and what the prior schools of thought are about art, the more foreknowledge I bring to it and see things there that maybe I wouldn't see otherwise. But then when I finally do see it, something new is happening. The Picasso is influencing me, and I am bringing to the Picasso what I've seen in my prior experience. Now, the wonderful thing about this being the way that we figure out the world is that it's not just, it's not saying that only experts in art come to the Picasso and they see things there because they're such experts. They bring a lot of foreknowledge that's formally the correct approach. That would be an old approach to science and positivism. This is saying that, oh, somebody from India who doesn't even know Western culture also brings a foreknowledge, and maybe he'll see something in the painting that nobody's seen before. Because he's going to be uniting his experience and his culture with a Picasso. And he's going to see a fragmented world, and maybe it'll remind him of one of what the many gods symbolize in Hinduism, about the fracture of the universe, or 1,000 faces of something. I don't know. I'm just speculating. But the point is that we all bring foreknowledge to what we see and perceive. And then we engage something, and there is a horizon that we have with that. It's a new horizon. And then as we experience it, and it impacts us and we impact it, there's a fusion of horizons, it's called. Now this is particularly true with people. This has a lot of implications. And this is radical in a certain way, because it suggests the power and the importance of whatever you bring to your understanding, which he positively refers to as prejudice. In many ways, Gadamer was about the revival of the legitimacy of prejudice. Not prejudice in the negative sense that we have it, but in recognizing that our brains and our minds and our experience bring with us a prejudice. Now, if you leave the room with your prejudices, then you're prejudiced in the classic sense. But what he's saying is that you bring your prejudices, then there's a fusion of horizons, and there's an evolution of thinking, an evolution of perception in the world, of hermeneutics, of interpretation. So the whole emphasis on interpretation, as opposed to perception, is that everything is always being interpreted because you're always bringing something new to it. Now, you can see the potential of this in terms of the whole issue of the relationship between one culture and another, between one group and another, between one religion and another. It has radical possibilities. Now, it should be said that for Gadamer himself, it also had some pretty conservative possibilities. Why? Because it meant that tradition, or the way that you framed the world in the past, has great relevance to how you perceive something, and it should. And so, for many people looking to break with the past in German culture after 1945, they felt that Gadamer was actually making it harder by well, how shall I put this? That a classic logical positivism position of just looking at things as they are, could divorce you from all the prejudices of the past. That's the classic Enlightenment, positivist dream. To embrace tradition and culture is to bring in all the problems of the past and say, my brain is still there. I'm not a tabula rasa. I'm not a clean slate. I'm bringing all this with me, and therefore tradition matters. How this painting has been interpreted in the past matters. But you can see that that would be, threatening in a certain way if there were philosophers who wanted to actually break with the past and focus on the future. The other threatening thing about Gadamer was the fact that there was a certain, and this is my critique or things that I've raised, is that there's a certain amorality to it. In other words, are there no absolutes? Are there things, how do you decide right and wrong? Let's say you come to a Nuremberg rally and you interpret that as a Gadamerian, and you see all the traditions from the past and all the things. Can you evaluate it? Can you say there's something wrong? How do you decide right and wrong in a Gadamerian universe if everything is about interpretation and prior experience and present experience and a fusion of horizons? Where is the factor of judgment, of saying something is objectively right or objectively wrong? It's not there in that methodology. Now, Gadamer himself had things to say about, a practical philosophy and practical experience, but there was always a question, especially as opposed to, who was the fellow who, he was, there were feelings that he accommodated himself to National Socialism and Nazism too easily, and there were attacks on that. But then there are also other German philosophers. I'm sorry I don't have it right now, the name of one of them that he was in dialogue with. It was very different, who focuses on developing a philosophy that has a clear way to determine a kind of right and wrong, and there was a concern with Gadamerian approaches that really could be used for anything. It could be used to justify any kind of fusion of horizons. Yeah, Luis.
So basically, it's kind of like saying, and the problem is if everybody has their own interpretation, and hence it's true, then there's basically no truth at all.
Yes, it's the relativist attack. It's the relativist assault here. That this notion of foreknowledge and fusion of horizons doesn't allow for any space of something being non-relative, and anything goes in a certain way. I mean, if the Nuremberg rallies make sense to you in terms of the evolution of the German psyche, and you see the patterns and it makes sense, then it's there. Where is the Kantian ability to say, no, this is wrong because the rally is scapegoating some people, and that means the principles evolved from that rally are not universalizable. In Immanuel Kant, you can't come to any imperatives in the world, things that you should do and must do, that can't apply to all people. That's his basic Kantian position. But if basically all you need is to fuse the past, the present, and the future in an artistic moment, where is the evaluation? Where is the ability to say no? This is wrong. So, for me, the reason why Gadamer is so important is not as a practical philosophy as much as it is as a way of understanding what Appleby will call in your writings the ambivalence of the sacred. How is it possible that the same traditions that observers can come to those traditions and come to such radically different conclusions? How can one pope celebrate human rights and another one depress them? They both have, a lot of knowledge of their traditions. How is that possible? You can't say now the faithful in every tradition, and I warned you about this at the beginning of the course, the faithful, somebody who's a faithful Catholic will have to say to you that, well, that person just didn't understand. But a scientific position is, no, unfortunately, this is a Gadameran universe in which things seem to be subject to the foreknowledge and the fusion of horizons between this particular leader and his interpretations. And that something new arises from those circumstances. It's an amoral philosophy in some ways. It's a mode of understanding how things happen. Yeah?
We can equate this with how Plato casts art out of his Republic, can't we? When he talks about how art is amoral, and I mean,
Right.
isn't this basically a regurgitation of that idea?
Well, the irony is that Gadamer was definitely saw himself as a Platonist. He wrote his PhD on it. And it's amazing what horizons will come up with, like throwing art out, or throwing books out, or burning books. You know, there's no limit to what people could come up with in terms of their horizon. And Plato, you know, has that moment in that evolution of the possibility. So I'm just so I don't want to get too far afield in this course to give a definitive analysis of Gadamer and Plato. What I'm interested in for this course is that largely Gadamer is an analyst of how things get interpreted, how we know the world, and the complications of that. Mary Stanger is the peacemaker here. She's moving Gadamer into the realm of practice and interfaith tolerance. And she does it in a very interesting way. She takes, and that's where I want to move with this. Because Gadamer is Gadamer, and he didn't have a whole lot to do with this field, but I want to demonstrate to you how Stanger moves this in a different direction. Basically, there's a kind of conversation structure to hermeneutics. Everything is about conversation, and Gadamer indeed thought that the truth and discovery was out of conversation. Again, the classic Socratic method. Because a conversation is an encounter between you and me. And the Gadamerian position is that I bring foreknowledge to you, I bring a lot of foreknowledge, you bring a lot of foreknowledge. If it's an honest exchange, we start exchanging information right away, and there's a fusion of horizons, and we both leave differently than we left before. At least in principle, it's possible. Now, you all know, not to forget the psychology we started in the first part, and that you're reading about, that there are all sorts of people with very hardened, regressed positions where nothing ever changes. They have a fixed view of the universe, and it doesn't change. We know secretaries of defense like that. We know all sorts of people like that. But in the classic human encounter, most human beings are affected by the people that they meet in some fashion, which is one of the reasons why gatekeepers don't want people of influence to meet other people sometimes, because they're trying to frame the universe that say a leader is in, that you don't want him exposed to this point of view or that point of view, because you know that he might be affected by it. And I see this in Congress all the time, that gatekeepers are there because congressmen, like I said, are more intense people, and they do get affected. But if a gatekeeper is there to keep the message straight and not get confused, then they're not going to want the congressman to meet this person who's going to take them off in left field. So that happens all the time. You don't want the mothers of the anti-war mothers to meet this person because look, we have a mission right now, and we know what we need to do rationally, and we don't want the congressman to get affected. So people are affected by each other. One of the main reasons why I believe that everybody says don't give legitimacy to this extremist group by bringing them to the table, that's a legitimate concern, the legitimation of extremism by negotiating with somebody. But more often than not, it's a way to avoid the cognitive inconsistency and dissonance of the fusion of horizons. I know that one of the most important things about my interreligious work in places of violence and conflict is the emotional trauma I'm going to go through every time I meet somebody that it was so much easier for me to demonize them. You know, every time. It was just easier. No matter how progressive I was, no matter how much I was crossing enemy lines, there were people I didn't want to meet. Sometimes for political reasons, because I didn't want to get tarred and feathered. Other times because I just didn't want to deal with them. You know, I met somebody a couple of weeks ago. I'm not in the mood right now. I mean, just to be perfectly frank, I've kind of had it recently with religious extremism. I've been much more open than many other people in the city, but I had it, and so I'm much more interested in parliamentarians around the world, Muslim, Christian, particularly interested in Muslim parliamentarians, people who are in the world trying to make a better place. And so I met with this group through the State Department, and we had a fabulous meeting. It was with a group from a certain country in the Gulf. Incredible meeting, a poor country. And there was a parliamentarian sitting on the left side of the room, and there were a series of teachers, some of them with beards, on the other side. One of the parliamentarian and I hit it off really well. And I really moved them because I said, you know, everybody's jealous of the Saudis, and I know you're upset with them and the things that they do, but oil is eventually not going to be. Oil's a curse. It actually makes countries worse. And if you can take the rifles out of the hands of the kids and put a science book there, I assure you, you're going to be ahead of Saudi Arabia someday. I'm very moved by that. And they welcomed me to the country in all sorts of rituals, ways, and they were very moved. One of them said to me, I never thought I'd be sitting with a Jew at the same table. This was one of the more, you know, extreme ones. And I can tell you this has changed my life, you know. But one of them introduced himself as a Salafi. Salafi is the word for Muslim fundamentalists now. You know, so Salafism is the dreaded philosophy of the Muslim Brotherhood and so on. I never met anybody that said they were Salafi. Okay, it's usually not something people say. So I was just whoa, I was just taken aback. And he asked me pointedly, would you work with me? Would you negotiate with me? So I just started hemming and hawing because I didn't know quite what to say, because I said in principle I talk to everyone, I work with everyone. But it put me on the spot because it was a boundary beyond which I haven't been going lately. I've been going to that parliamentarian who was also a traditional Muslim, but so it's just we all have our boundaries, and that's a lot of times when people don't want to negotiate or say no negotiation, it's because they are terrified of being in the room and by the fusion of the horizons that will then change who they are and would have to change their political philosophy. Because 9 times out of 10 you meet people and you may completely disagree with their actions in the world, but you'll often find, oh my gosh, there's a logic to why they're doing what they're doing. There are grievances that are real. There are interests that are real. There are things that I never heard of before. So that, for example, in that room, it was clear to me that for all the mantras about the Palestinian cause, what really was exercising the Salafis in the room was that they had been convinced that Israel was destroying the Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif, with excavations and with a systematic effort. And my strength in my field is these moments where I'm good on my feet. Not so good in a lot of other things, but I'm good on my feet. And I said to him, well, that's exactly why you need to go to Israel. Because you need to find out for yourself, and you need to struggle for this yourself. We need you there. We need a lot of third parties. You know, and if what you're saying is true, then come and fight for that. Come and negotiate with people. Which is something he knows he can't do because his government won't let him. But I'm provoking at that moment the challenge of freedom, the challenge to freely engage your enemies. I could have sat there and said, oh no, that's exaggerated. Yeah, there are excavations, and there are certain people in Israel who would like there to be a temple there instead of the mosque. and it is a scary situation, but they're not in control of that area, and those excavations are purely archaeological. And on the contrary, I could have said defensively that the Waqf, the religious authorities in Islam there, are doing their own excavating, that is taking out and destroying Jewish artifacts, which is also part of the complex picture of that blessed or cursed, few hundred, quarter of a mile there that has led to so much destruction. The reason I say all this to you is because by the fusion of horizons between me and him, it became apparent to me that what he had been educated into feeling most humiliated by was the fact that this third holiest place in Islam was being slowly destroyed by the Jews. And the truth or falsehood or partial truth or 90% true, 50% true didn't matter as much as the fact that that was the thing that, after feeling very safe with me, he would bring up in an emotional way. That was it. So I understood a Salafi sensibility in a deep way that would have to shift my priorities in what I would do in conflict resolution in the Arab-Israeli conflict. It affirms a lot of things I said in my books, which is that consistently the people doing the negotiations did not have in their minds all of the sensibilities necessary for solutions that were going to be very broad. It couldn't just be about water, it couldn't just be about refugees, it couldn't just be about geographic boundaries. It was many things, including the Salafi who believes that Israel was destroying the third holiest place in Islam. And then to complicating things even more, there's how many people think they own that spot. You would think that the billion Muslims in the world want the Palestinians to own it. That's not true. It turns out that there are many royal claims to the proprietary rights to that holy spot. So it's very complicated. You got to really know these things by the fusion of many horizons. You got to realize that the Jordanians think that they own that, and the Saudis think they have a proprietary role in sacred places, and the Moroccans have a stake. And then worst of worst, which I learned recently, is that if you're really anti-Palestinian or you don't want Palestinian nationalism to threaten Israel, then you actually might embrace all those other Arab and Muslim claims, precisely to defang the Palestinian position. You see? You see how complicated it is? But the only way I knew that was by sitting one part of my day with a Salafi from this country in the Gulf, and the other part of my day reading the autobiography of a head of the Israeli CIA, the Mossad, to understand negotiating positions and ways in which people can try to play off of each other. And only with all those horizons can you start to figure out how can we move towards what is fair and just and that will bring in the most people to a peace process. But the emotional cost of having those direct meetings or with that range of people is very high. The emotional dissonance of dealing with extremely religious people on the one side of all different groups and also people in militaries and intelligence agencies is a very difficult discipline. And most people, just can't do all that. So it takes a tremendous amount of discipline. But the theory and the principle of it, what Mary Stanger is trying to do is say that this is what creates not only peace, but it creates a new understanding of reality. If Gadamer is saying this is how we change the cognitive structure of our world, is by these fusions of horizons. And she feels, very interestingly, that the more interfaith work we do at a deep level, the more that it's creating a fusion of horizons in a religious realm. And I agree with her. I think that in the last 100 years of human history, of the Parliament of World Religions beginning in the last part of the last decade of the 19th century, all the way up to the present, is we're seeing an unprecedented fusion of horizons where you take 25 representatives of 10 different religions, you put them all in the same room, and something new is happening. They have to say how they're different, but they also start talking about how they're in common. Or we all agree to this. And somehow the language of human rights, for example, is more and more universalized among representatives of different religious faiths around the world.